So welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Laura. I'm the program director at the Interfaith Center at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And our mission at the Interfaith Center is to invite people from diverse secular, spiritual, and religious traditions to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and friendship. We seek to unify people around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society. So tonight we are talking with Jeff Richey, and let me tell you a little bit about Jeff. He's a specialist or a scholar on Confucius, and so I'm excited to introduce him. Jeff is a professor of Asian Studies at Berea College, where he has taught courses in East Asian cultural. Pardon me for the background noise. Let me start that again. Jeff Richey is a professor of Asian Studies at Berea College, where he has taught courses in East Asian cultural, intellectual, and religious history since 2002. He earned his Ph.D. at the Graduate Theological Union's cooperative program with UC-Berkeley, his master's at Harvard University, and his BA at UNC-Greensboro. A specialist in Confucian and Daoist studies, his book-length publications include Teaching Confucianism, Confucius in East Asia, Confucianism's History in China, Korea, Japan, and Viet Nam, The Sage Returns, Confucian Revival in Contemporary China, and Daoism in Japan, Chinese Traditions and Their Influence on Japanese Religious Culture. He has served as the Chinese philosophy area editor for the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy and has published in many journals on religion and Asian studies. So welcome, Jeff. I'm going to hand it over to you to educate us and enlighten us tonight about Confucius.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Laura, and thanks also to my colleague at Miami, Dr. Liz Wilson, for connecting us in the first place. It's a pleasure to be with you guys tonight. I'm going to share a screen so that everybody should see a title slide now that has the title of tonight's talk. Can we confirm that? A nod of the head or something like that? Very good. All right. So let's, without further ado, let's get into this. Looks like I can admit people. That's fun. So I did. Hang on a minute. There we go. So one of the first issues we probably need to face head on is this question of what the topic of Confucianism has to do with any program run by a so-called interfaith center, because one of the perennial questions for the last 100 or 150 years, or perhaps even longer, at least in the West, has been whether and how what we might call Confucianism qualifies as a faith, as a religious or spiritual tradition. And I have to be honest, after more than 20 years of thinking about this question, I'm probably less interested now in that question than I've ever been in my life. And the reason is because I have learned by and large that answers to that question tell me very little about Confucian traditions. They usually tell me about where the person asking the question is coming from. And so since my goal has been to understand Confucian traditions rather than people who are asking questions about Confucian traditions, it's played, it's attracted me less and less over time. But I think a useful response to that type of question, is Confucianism a religion, or is Confucianism philosophy, or is it whatever, might be to, instead of imposing some set of Western definitions onto a non-Western tradition and then trying to see whether and how they fit and drawing whatever conclusions you can, I think perhaps it would be smarter to turn to Chinese sources and ask, how has this tradition or other traditions like it been understood in Chinese culture? And about 2,000 years ago, a little more than 2,000 years ago, there was an attempt to write a kind of encyclopedia of the world's peoples and customs as known to the Chinese during the Han Dynasty. And it was written by a fellow called Ying Shao. And Ying Shao wrote this text called The Comprehensive Discussion of Customs, or Fengsu Tongyi, in which he tries to account for every known variation on humanity available to his knowledge at the time. And one of the questions that intrigues him the most is what people call in Chinese shun. And if you can see my cursor here, I'm circling the Romanized version of this character, and then this is the character itself. Shun can be translated in lots of ways. On its own, it can mean God or spirit. And as far as that's concerned, it can refer to a part of a human being, but it could also refer to a supernatural being. It forms part of the Chinese term Shinto. That's the Shin in Shinto. So it's a pronunciation of a Chinese character in a slightly Japanese fashion. But it can also be an adjective, because classical Chinese is fun like that. Words can be nouns, they can be verbs, they can be adjectives, depending on context. So you could also translate shun as something like divine or godly or spiritual or holy, any of those things. He was very interested, Ying Shao, in figuring out why and what people called shun. Whether it was identifying them as gods or identifying something as sacred or whatever it was. And he entertains various possibilities. He's sort of for those of you who know the history of thinking about religion in the West, he's sort of the Emil Durkheim of the Han Dynasty. He's somebody who's trying to think sociologically about culture and religion. And he ends up saying this, 物之所就思有神, things around which people gather or congregate, form a mass. Those are what gets called shun. Those will be deemed divine. So in other words, he took his cue from sort of sociological data and noticed that no matter what people said that they were gathering around or what it was that was going on with the thing they were gathering around something. Whether it was an image of the Buddha or an ancestor's grave or whatever it was. And so he decided that that was probably the most universal definition of shun that there could possibly be. So if we want to take that cue, it actually works really well for the Confucian tradition, because the Confucian tradition, above all else, is preoccupied with the social, with where and how people congregate together. In short, the Confucian tradition tends to look at being a human as a team sport, something that you cannot do by yourself or completely on your own. I think from most people's perspective in the Confucian tradition, that kind of radical iconoclasm or individualism that says that I best find my highest meaning on my own doesn't understand what it is to be a human. To be a human is to be a member of some kind of group from a Confucian perspective. And then life consists of overlapping concentric circles of groups to which one belongs. So there is a self, there is a person that we could talk about as an individual, but that person is defined in the most local way by some kind of group, the immediate family, the natal family, the intergenerational family. Beyond that, there's an extended family. In pre-modern China, lineage was constructed in ways that allowed people who had, by American notions, rather flimsy levels of common descent, they could still participate in the same clan or group. So this could be quite a large group of people. It might be everybody else in your village, for example, in some cases. And then beyond that, people that you share the regional identity with or some kind of language tradition with. China is a really, really big country that speaks many different versions of Chinese, some of which are so much different from each other that they don't even sound like the same language and are not mutually intelligible. So Cantonese speakers, Mandarin speakers, Shanghai dialect speakers, that might be another group that you belong to. And then in more recent times, especially the notion of belonging to a Chinese nation or a Chinese state, or as Confucianism exported itself or was imposed outside of Chinese borders, the Vietnamese state, the Japanese state, various Korean states. So all of these groups are ways in which people congregate, and what they're congregating around at some level is the group. And so we might say that what's holy, or what's shun in the Confucian tradition, is the most basic form of human group, which from its perspective typically is articulated as the family, an intergenerational family. That raises certain challenges for Confucian tradition in more recent years, especially in mainland China, but all over the developed world where the size of families has contracted. And intergenerational families don't look exactly like they used to, but nonetheless, there's still that immediate group. So I hope that makes some sense as a starting point for thinking about Confucianism is essentially a kind of group-oriented view of what it means to be a human being. But there's one other way I think we can do this, which is to look at a modern Chinese thinker who also was trying to think sociologically about things like religion and culture. And that was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley in the 60s, Professor C.K. Yang. And he wrote a book called Religion in Chinese Society that, for those of us who work on East Asian religious culture, has been really invaluable. And I think arguably has made a big contribution to how many people have thought about things like religion. And the key takeaway from his work is this distinction between diffused and institutional religion. And some of you may be familiar with this, but if not, let me say a few words about it. Yang pointed out that people who were used to religion as defined by Western norms, say the Catholic Church or various kinds of Jewish or Protestant tradition, whatever, tended to think in terms of what he called institutional religion. That is to say, religion identified with certain institutional structures, both metaphorically and literally. So churches, synagogues, mosques, but also institutions in the sense of an identity based on being a kind of card-carrying member of this or that institution. So someone identifying themselves as confessionally as a Catholic Christian or a Protestant Christian, for example, or identifying themselves as a member of a group that keeps kosher, right? So identifying themselves in some sort of Jewish orthodoxy. And he didn't want to argue that that wasn't religion. He just wanted to argue that that might not be the only kind of religion that's out there. And from his point of view, the real failure of the West was to look past its own cultural norms and see that there might be different modes or styles of doing religion cross-culturally, and especially in East Asia. And this is important because when he looked at religion in Chinese society, which is the name of his book, he found that institutional religion by any measure certainly existed. There were temples, there were scriptures, there were clerical hierarchies, priests, and so forth. It's just that wasn't how most people interacted with religion. And I'm borrowing a graphic from some colleagues here to illustrate that. If you can see this image of these three pyramids or three mountains, it's meant to suggest that at the narrowest point of demographic participation in each institutional religion, so if we look at China, traditionally that's Daoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, we do see institutional religion. We see text-based religious practices performed by established religious hierarchy that has various kinds of rules. And so it's very possible to experience institutional religion in China and has been for thousands of years. But this graphic, I think, helps us see that the further we travel down in each of these institutional pyramids or mountains, two things happen. One is that they tend to intersect with each other and not remain independent. So at their narrowest point of participation, there are Buddhist nuns and monks who might consider themselves absolutely and exclusively Buddhist. And they're not Confucians, they're not Daoists, they're not participating in those institutions, they're participating in this institution. But the further we travel down the demographic pyramid and get further away from those elites who define and run the institutions, the more we see them running into people who are participating in other traditions. And so at the very base of the pyramid, it's really just one big mass, one big bedrock shared by all three of these mountains or pyramids, if you like. And one thing that's interesting to notice there is that a great deal of what gets called Chinese popular religion, meaning religious practices, religious ideas, religious images that don't fit into a narrow institutionally based understanding, including a Confucian understanding, actually look fairly Confucian. So for example, ancestor reverence, which unfortunately this diagram is misspelled, not my fault, but it's there. A good deal of China's divination tradition based on texts called the I Ching comes out of the Confucian tradition. Many seasonal observances have to do with Confucian traditions. And for reasons that I'll talk about in a little bit, some cosmological ideas, like the ideas of yin and yang, or the ideas of 5 phases or elements of matter and the universe, got folded into Confucianism really, really early on. And so it's interesting, we can actually find Confucianism at both points of the sociological spectrum in the Chinese experience. We can certainly find institutionally defined Confucianism, sectarian, hierarchical, not clerical exactly, but definitely elite-based, text-oriented practices and traditions. But far more, we will find people participating in what we could call Confucian aspects of Chinese popular religion without having to have it mediated by any of these 3 institutions. I hope this distinction makes some sense. Yang used the word diffused to get at this lower in terms of power relationship level of religious experience. But I think that's a really inspired metaphor, because when I think of the word diffused, I think of tea. When we make tea, right, we can take tea leaves or tea in a bag, and we can immerse it in hot water. And after a very short time, it's very difficult to tell where the hot water begins and the tea ends, or vice versa. They've diffused into one another. And that was the point that Yang was making, that at this level, it's really hard to tell where the Confucianism stops and the Daoism starts. And by the same token, it's really hard to tell where religion stops and culture begins. So there's a diffusion at that level as well. And I think one of the difficulties that East Asian societies have had in encountering Western defined modernity is that lack of a clear institutional distinction between, say, religion and culture, in the way that, at least since the Protestant Reformation, a lot of Westerners have insisted on having. It doesn't seem to work very well in China. I hope I'm making some sense. There will be some time for some questions, so if you have questions about this particular, please hang on, and we'll get to it. Having said that, let's just dive into Confucian stuff, whether we understand it as institutional or diffused. I would like to talk tonight about what I see as 4 types of Confucianism, and these are, fairly arbitrary categories, but I think they describe 4 ways that people experience the tradition. And some of these are more institutional and some of these are more diffused. I think of these 4, the most institutional are number 1, number 2, and number 4. And most diffused is probably number 3, but there are elements of diffused and institutional religion in each of them. They are scholars' Confucianism. So in other words, this is the Confucianism promoted by people who, for lack of an equivalent to a priest or a monastic community, really perform that clerical function in the Confucian tradition, perhaps a bit like rabbis or imams in some Western traditions, Confucian scholars. Then there's rulers' Confucianism, Confucianism as a tool of the state, which is a huge part of Confucianism's history across East Asia and continues to play a role today. Householders' Confucianism. Confucianism is a family values tradition that helps organize people's family life. That's also really, really important. I would say historically 2 and 3 are probably the big ones here, but 4 is also important. And it's really more of a modern category. Nations' Confucianism. Confucianism as an expression of national identity and even nationalism. So I'd like to sort of run through those 4 fairly quickly in turn. To begin with, scholars' Confucianism is to begin with arguably the first Confucian, Confucius himself. Perhaps you've wondered why we use this Latin-sounding name for this ostensibly Chinese person. And for this, we can blame or credit the Jesuit missionaries who arrived from Renaissance Europe, late Renaissance Europe in Ming Dynasty China in the 1500s. They were very concerned, obviously, to spread Christianity in China, but they were also almost equally concerned to literally translate Chinese culture back for Western audiences, particularly educated Western audiences back home in Europe, who all read Latin as their primary scholarly language and the primary language of intellectual exchange. And so they Romanized or Latinized a great many key texts and titles and terms and thinkers' names. And the first of these was Confucius. So they took one version of this person's name. I've given you here the more common version of his name, which is Kongzi. Kong is a family name, like my last name is Richey, right? Good Irish American name. Zi is a title, like I have Ph.D. at the end of my business card. So it's something kind of like Dr. Richey or Dr. Kong, except in ancient China, Zi, when it was affixed like this, indicated that you were someone who had attracted disciples because those people had decided that you had mastered something, and that as a master you could mediate some wisdom, some knowledge to them. So there are lots of Zi. Zi is in no way a Confucian, uniquely Confucian title. There's Lao Zi that many people have heard of, associated with Daoist traditions. Many other Zi that are neither Confucian nor Daoist. It's a pretty generic term. So by calling someone Kongzi, what they were saying in his time was, oh, this is someone who is a master Kong. By the time of the 1500s, when the Jesuits show up in China, it had become customary in some very institutional Confucian circles to insert another word in between Kong and Zi, the word Fu, which means sort of amplifies the honorific quality of the title, something like the most revered master Kong. And so in the Chinese at the time, it'd be something like Confucius. And so somehow out of Confucius, we got Confucius. So that's where that comes from. So I'm just going to call him either Confucius or Kongzi, as long as you know I'm talking about the same person. He does seem to have really existed. There have been some things published in the last 20 years that have suggested, as with other world historical figures like Jesus and others, that maybe this person never really existed. It was just a myth. I think we're fairly certain this person existed, but who exactly he was is really a product of the portrait given to us by people who came after his time. So in some way, it's probably hard to know who the real historical Confucius was. What we do know is that in his own time, socially and politically, he belonged to a particular sector of ancient Chinese society called Shi. These were people who were literate and therefore elite to some extent, but they were not aristocrats. They were not people who held real political power. They were seen as indispensable to the aristocrats who did hold power because they were literate, because they could do things like record documents, interpret history, and perform divination, which are sort of three functions of literacy in ancient China. But they didn't run things. They were employees, not employers. And he also belonged to a kind of a subculture that, if we were to translate it into modern American English, it might be geek or something like this, or nerd. Something that a lot of academics can relate to. The term here is Ru, and Ru originally comes from words that mean something like weakling, not a strong man, not a man who was a manly man in ancient Chinese notions of gender, because he was so geeky about things like poetry or ritual or art or whatever it might be. And so this is sort of who Kongzi seems to have been, right? So he's this kind of low-level bureaucrat who geeks out. What does he geek out about? He geeks out about the past. And the reason that he's especially geeky about the past, which for him was the past before 771 BCE. That's a milestone moment in early Chinese history because it marks the breakup of the Zhou dynasty into these small chunks of warring states, which then spend about 500 years battling it out to become the next unified dynasty. One of them, the Qin, eventually is successful in 221, and it's from its name that we get the word China, actually, to this day. He lived in this China. He lived in the China that was broken up into very small parts. And he lived in a part that was so small that it's not even on this map. It's right over here on the Shandong Peninsula. It was a small state called Lu. And very shortly after his lifetime, it was swallowed up by larger neighbors, which were in turn swallowed up by even larger neighbors. That period of time was very unpleasant. It was a period of chronic instability due to civil war, assassinations, coups, abuse of power, corruption. When I talk about this with my students, I often compare it to the kind of power interactions that you see in gangster dramas. gangster movies where might makes right. There's a code of loyalty, but everybody ignores it when their self-interest is on the line. And Kongzi was rightly concerned about this, rightly disturbed about this. What may make him different from other people who've lived through what, after all, is an unfortunately all too common human experience of war and strife and uncertainty, is that instead of imagining a future where the problems of the present would be corrected or eliminated, he imagined instead that the past held all the answers to resolving the problems of the present. And so this is a really key thing to know about the Confucian tradition, is that the impulse in the Confucian tradition is always to assume that human beings have been around for a fairly long time. And actually the amount of time that's elapsed since Confucius's time up to ours is really small compared to the whole history of the species. And the Confucians seem to have understood this to some degree. They assumed that the best that had been thought and said had probably already been done, and that it was not a question of inventing a wheel, but rather reinventing wheels that were previously known to human beings. And he, following this logic, asked himself, when was the last time human beings got along well? When was the last time that rulers were righteous and acted out of the best interest of the whole community and not just for their own self-aggrandizing power? And for him, that was the earlier part of this Zhou dynasty. So he idealized that past as not only the model human society, but also as a source of solutions for the present in which he lived. During his time, he was a failure. When I first started graduate school, I thought about writing a dissertation called Confucius the Failure. Not to denigrate Confucius, but to really explore what we might call a tragic side of his life, that he never got to see his ideals fully implemented. He did succeed to the extent that he had students who called him master. Those students had students, those students had students, and so forth and so on. And eventually, those disciples of disciples of disciples became politically and culturally influential. And just a few years ago on Chinese state TV, there was a television program where someone portraying Confucius, who this is who this is supposed to be, is magically transported to the 21st century. And the state media program has these various people point out that everybody knows certain chunks of his writings, or everybody knows these Confucian ideas. And at one point he starts basically crying and says, "That's what I've dreamed of." Well, he had to have dreamt of it during his lifetime, because he certainly didn't achieve it. It really fell to his successors. And these are the Confucian scholars who pass on the tradition. They also shape everything we know about what he supposedly said and did. And so the primary source for that stuff is something called in Chinese Lun Yu. Lun means discussions, organized conversation, something like that. Lun Yu. Yu is speech. Lun has to do with organizing words. So there's an old-fashioned English word, analects, that we sometimes use. And we don't have time, I think, to go through this in great detail, but I want to point out a couple of key passages. One is this notion of heaven, or tian. It literally means sky, but it also takes on something akin to what in Star Wars is called the Force, a kind of a cosmic pattern that gives order and meaning to the universe, but at the same time has to be used by humans, or humans have to cooperate with it. It doesn't just do things like, Deus ex machina, some sort of God coming out and just making things happen. Heaven relies on human agents, prophetic human agents. And Confucius saw certain key figures in history as operating with heaven's blessing. But he also thought that anybody could understand what it is that heaven wanted. And he called that Tianming, the mandate of heaven. So we have sort of an interesting tension here. We have a universe with a long moral arc that bends towards justice, as Martin Luther King once said. But at the same time, we have innately in human beings the capacity to see and understand and participate in that arc. And that meant really that for Kongzi, for Confucius, the key really was to think globally and act locally. Since heaven had a pattern, had a plan for everything and everybody. It was really a question of performing your role locally in the right way to help bring out that part of the arc. And so, for example, there's a passage in the Analects where someone says, basically, why are you such a loser? Why are you not involved in government? Why don't you have a big status job? You talk a good game, but you're not employed by anybody who's in a real position to implement your ideas. And he says, well, let's look at the past. What does this ancient text, the Book of History, say about filial piety, which is a really important Confucian value, the value of being true to what your relationships require of you. So if you're a son, be a good son. If you're a father, be a good father, etc. It says, just by being a good son and friendly to one's siblings, you can have an effect on government. That's sort of Confucianism in a nutshell. If we can be good human beings, playing our particular human role in a particular place and time, that will have a ripple effect because we're all nested together in these concentric group hierarchies. And by being a good son or being a good father or being a good teacher or being a good employee, that's going to rub off on people around me. Just the same way that people who don't do those jobs rub off on people around them. So it was really important to think about the effect that you had on other people. And he believed that if everybody lived up to these ideals, we wouldn't have to have a revolution. We would just sort of start living in a more beautiful world. After his death, other ideas that probably weren't originally part of his view got swept into the Confucian tradition. And these include the ideas that there are 5 cosmic phases. In Chinese, Wu Xing, this originally refers to the 5 visible planets. Xing means walker or mover, like planet means walker or mover in Greek. And so they're identified with the planets, but they were connected to various elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, various seasons, spring, summer, and so forth, the tones of the 5-note pentatonic scale. It just goes on and on and on. And so this became a way to sort of see how the human realm, for example, positions of government at the court, or relationships in a family, like being a mother or a son, fit into a cosmic pattern. Along the same lines, ideas about yin and yang, the idea of a sort of an active versus a receptive role, masculine, feminine, there's a whole bunch of binaries there. Those also became ways for folks to think about ways in which living out their roles allowed them to participate in a cosmic drama. That it wasn't just about being in the family anymore, it was about moving with the other cosmic phases, participating in the cosmic drama of yin and yang in your marriage, in your friendship, in your work, whatever. It's not just about you, it's about everything that you touch. And so ultimately, the whole universe is connected. And later on, like in the Korean Confucian tradition, they will talk a lot about this and say that basically when you get this, you will get rid of your ego, because you'll realize that everything's identical with you, and everything's connected to you. And this is the way to sort of perfect your own nature, is to think about all the ripple effects you're having and the other things are having on you. I'm looking at the time and realizing that I need to move a little more quickly. So I'm going to do that. After the mess of Confucius's lifetime was cleaned up by a brief unifying regime called the Qin, it gave way to a much longer lasting dynasty called the Han, which is more or less contemporary with the Roman Empire. And that's where we get our words for modern Chinese characters, Hanzi, and modern Chinese language, Hanyu, and the ethnic majority of Chinese people today, Han. So all this goes back to the Han. And the Han had a problem, which is they had a much larger territory than any previous China that had existed. And it was beginning to be ethnically diverse, reaching into Central Asia, reaching into Southeast Asia, and they needed a way to glue it all together. And just like other empire builders around the same time in India, in the Mediterranean, they reached out for religious ideology to kind of hold this together. And interestingly enough, Confucianism was the choice made by the Han. And this is sort of that Constantinian moment in the history of Confucianism. Had a guy called Dong Zhongshu not appealed to the court in the mid-100s to say, look, I think this is the ideology that will hold this all together, maybe somebody else would have gotten the gig. Or maybe there would have been an earlier opportunity for Buddhism, who knows? But as it was Confucianism. And so the state really gets involved, and it begins to organize government service around mastery of Confucian literature, Confucian history, poetry, ritual. There is a state university called the Taixue, the Grand Academy. And by the end of the Han, they've trained over 30,000 people to staff the bureaucracy of the Han government. So at this point, state and Confucianism are really inseparable. And that's partly because of people like Dong Zhongshu, who frankly kissed up to the Han rulers and said, you guys are the ones that can hold all this together. And they looked at the way that the character for king is written, or ruler is written in Chinese. We have it here in stroke order. So ... And he says, if you look at that character, what you're seeing is a kind of symbol. You're seeing three things: heaven, earth, and humanity, connected by a thread. That thread is the king. That thread is the ruler. So again, there's this sense of people playing social roles that have cosmological significance, that have deeper kinds of meaning and power. And this really sets the tone for most of the rest of Chinese history, where almost every government is going to staff itself with Confucian-trained bureaucrats. I think I need to move a bit more quickly. So in the wake of the Han, much of what we might call the core of China gets Confucianized, partly through the incentive of knowing that if you want to get the best job in the country, which is working for the government, you're going to have to master this stuff. There's also a certain amount of colonization going on in the Han and afterwards. And then, of course, there's some conquest. A lot of Korean history has lived in the shadow of Chinese political control. A lot of the history of northern Vietnam also. And then through trade and diplomacy, it spreads elsewhere, like Japan and the rest of what today we would call Vietnam. And so that makes it possible that by about 1,500 years after Confucius's lifetime, you have people in Korea who probably would have been considered barbarians by Confucius, thinking that they're very civilized because they've embraced this tradition, and this has taught them how to be, the best that human beings can be. Householders' Confucianism really has to wait until the Chinese state has so thoroughly spread and introduced Confucianism that it becomes something that's sort of taken for granted. And then it becomes a way to do what other religious groups in China are already doing, particularly the Daoists and the Buddhists, but to do it in a way that seemed less freaky, at least as far as the comparison to Daoism was concerned, or less foreign, because although Buddhism originated in India and spread to China quite early on, about 2,000 years ago, it never totally lost its foreign associations, especially in medieval China. So if you had ethnocentric or nationalistic inclinations, if you were a member of the world's first really large middle class, which is Song Dynasty China about 1,000 years ago, you might be attracted to Confucianism, and many men were who organized their families around this. Helping that along was a guy called Zhu Xi. Zhu Xi put together a number of things. He revamped the curriculum for government civil service, but maybe most importantly, he authored a text that was designed to give emerging middle-class men a way to organize their family and feel like they had respectable, organized family lives. And this text is called now Zhu Zi Jia Li, Master Zhu. It's the same Zi we saw earlier, family rituals, Jia Li. And these are quite exhausting in their details. But when you look at what Zhu Xi says in his preface about why he wrote this book, it's actually kind of moving. He says, from the perspective of how ritual is carried out at home, the fundamental elements are to preserve roles and responsibilities. There's that emphasis on social roles again, and give substantial form to love and respect. He goes on elsewhere in the preface and says, the problem is that Confucius lived a long time ago, and we've lost track a lot of our traditions. We don't know why we do them anymore. But what we want to do is give form to love and respect in the family. We want people to feel like they're included and they belong and that they're respected. Ritual provides a way for us to do that. And if we do that, we will be able to regulate the beginning and ending of human affairs. Again, there's that sense of the cosmic coming out of the microcosmic. This sometimes takes really dramatic forms. Like, for example, the practice of gegu, which means to cut the thigh. Gegu probably originated in Buddhist texts, and was appropriated by Confucians beginning around 1,900 years ago. But it was a way to dramatize the extraordinary lengths to which people would go to completely fulfill their social role. So the classic story is typically of a daughter-in-law performing some act of self-sacrifice to effect some kind of miraculous cure or something else that would save her mother-in-law, because these are people who have the least in common in the traditional Chinese family. They're not related by blood. Everybody in the family whose male was born there, the father and his sons, everybody whose female was born somewhere else and married in, the mother and any daughters-in-law. So these people, this is a classic recipe for drama in Chinese fiction, the mother-in-law hating the daughter-in-law and so forth. But in these Confucian stories, like the story of the wife of Wang Wuzi, it says a lot that we don't know her name, we just know her husband's name. Wang Wuzi had a wife who was worried about her mother-in-law. Her mother-in-law was sick. And so she has a vision one day that she cuts off a piece of her own body and makes a healing broth with it, that it'll cure her terminally ill mother-in-law. Guess what happens? Mother-in-law is saved, right? There are dozens of stories like this. In fact, they became part of an official curriculum that was used in Chinese schools up into the 19th century. And then there are other forms of householders Confucianism, particularly in Japan, where the samurai or the military retainer class really embraced Confucian ideas. And it became part of the code of these warriors. So being a warrior meant not showing cowardice on the battlefield, devoting yourself to military training, but it also meant never being unfilial to your father or mother. You have to be a good son as well as a good warrior. Don't be disrespectful to people. Everybody's got a role to play. Don't look down on peasants. Don't kiss up to the higher ups. Everybody's got their role in the social machine, and don't be uneducated. Don't be unsophisticated. Learn, particularly poetry. The Confucians are the great advocates for poetry in East Asian culture. So this permeates all of East Asia. And by the time we get to the modern world, and the emergence of nation states, we have the two examples I want to leave you with of nations Confucianism. One is a bit old now, about 150 years old, and that was when Japan modernized in 1868. They took the world that the samurai built and reorganized it, but they retained a great many of the samurai's Confucian values. And so, having deposed the shogun or military dictator in the 1860s and put the emperor back in charge, they reinvented a great deal of the Confucian values, and if anything, made it tighter than it had been in the samurai period. So, for example, every head of a large set of families, a soku, a male household head, would have control over property, marriages, living arrangements, and mandatory ancestor rituals for everybody in the family. So this one person would have a lot of authority, and to defy that person was to be unfilial. This also played a role in the larger nationalistic political project of the state, particularly for women who were told that they needed to be ryosai, kembo, good wives and wise mothers, not only to make nice, harmonious families full of filial children, but also to raise loyal subjects and soldiers for the emperor. So this kind of Confucianism is very explicitly about advancing the nation state. And if you look at documents, for example, such as the Imperial Rescript on Education, which was a document that was read and studied in Japanese schools from 1890 through 1945, when that system came crashing down with defeat, it says things like subjects need to be filial. This is the Constitution, right? This is sort of the basic character of the country. Be filial to your parents. Be harmonious in your marriages. Be modest, pursue learning and cultivate arts, always so that you can offer yourselves courageously to the state and thus guard and maintain the prosperity of our imperial throne. So again, there's this kind of co-opting of what we've previously called scholars and householders Confucianism into a new kind of rulers Confucianism, which is really more about the modern nation state than any previous notion of a dynasty or a regime. When we get to more recent times, we can find another example of nations Confucianism, and that's in contemporary China. And this is a really startling development, especially for those of us who studied China in the 80s and 90s, as I did. As an undergrad and graduate student, I really didn't see this coming. But it's been very fruitful for me as a scholar, I have to say. And so what's happened? Well, to collapse most of the 20th century into just a few sentences, China had a revolution. It had several revolutions. The first revolution got rid of the emperors in 1912. The second revolution got rid of the middle class, the bourgeoisie and the aristocrats in 1949 with the Communist Revolution. And then there was another revolution, the Cultural Revolution of 1966 through 1976. This is the last 10 years of the communist revolutionary leader Mao Zedong's life. And in that time period, he tried to, as much as possible, erase much of Chinese tradition. On the grounds that it was holding China back from achieving true communist fulfillment as a country. After Mao died in 1976, however, there was a steady process of reconnecting with tradition, and especially since the 90s, the Chinese state, which is still a one-party Communist Party state, has actually reintroduced Confucianism at multiple levels. And it's kind of startling. Again, if all you know about China is Chairman Mao, then this doesn't really fit. So there are state media produced programs like the one I referred to earlier, but also cartoons for kids. This is from the Hello Confucius media campaign, which was modeled after Japan's Hello Kitty sort of character. There was, a few years ago now, a very expensive historical biopic made about Confucius with the Hong Kong martial arts star Zhao Yun-fat playing Confucius. It didn't do very well, I have to say, and that's partly because the movie Avatar opened the same week in China, and a lot of people were more interested in seeing Avatar than seeing Confucius. But the fact is that the state put a lot of money behind that. You can find Confucian texts in curricula from kindergarten through college and graduate school, in the same way that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you could find the thought of Chairman Mao in those kinds of curricula. So that's a really interesting shift. All over the world, there are Confucius Institutes. I don't know if Miami University has one, but many universities do. These are state-funded organs from China that seek to promote Chinese culture and language. In this country, they've often been politicized, but the truth is they're all quite different. It depends on who's running them. Many of them are not political at all. And then probably the most interesting phenomenon to me are the phenomenon of Confucian marriages. There were Confucian marriages, but these basically kind of look like church weddings, but they're Confucianized, so they're very much an invented tradition. And finally, I think it's significant that the man who's been the president of China since 2012 and 13, Xi Jinping, has actually written a book called How to Read Confucius. He's probably famous for two things. One is re-communizing China in certain ways, but at the same time re-Confucianizing China. And when he gave a speech in 2014 on the 2565th anniversary of Confucius's birth, he said, the Chinese nation has always been peace-loving. Our love for peace is deeply rooted in Confucianism, which is really a problem-solving tradition. It's about learning how to live with difference, learning how to live with hierarchies and so forth and across cultures. If you want to understand China, you have to study Confucius and Confucianism. So this graphic illustrates the ghost of Chairman Mao and the ghost of Confucius, of each whispering in Xi Jinping's ear as more or less equal influences on him. So when we think about China today, as well as the rest of Confucianism's legacy across East Asia, I think I'd like to leave you with 4 questions about each of the forms of Confucianism I've tried to outline. Scholars Confucianism, can it survive the supremacy of STEM education in East Asia? Confucianism is a very humanities kind of tradition. It's about history and poetry and the arts. And most government officials of China for the last 30 or 40 years have been engineers. They haven't been people who have degrees in literature or history or anything like that. So it makes you wonder to what extent that can have any real cultural or political force if people aren't coming out of that educational background that traditionally has nurtured it. Rulers Confucianism, a major question for a lot of people, particularly in places like Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, is can a state embrace Confucian values and also democracy at the same time? There's nothing innately democratic about Confucianism, but by the same token, there's no reason why it can't be modified in ways that make it amenable to democratic processes. And some people have proposed various versions of this, but most of Confucianism history has tended to line up with authoritarian governments. So that's going to be a real question, I think, for the tradition moving forward. What about householders Confucianism? What about Confucianism as something that's meaningful to people at the family level? I think the big questions here are, to what extent can that kind of spirituality empower women and those who fall outside of a heteronormative family? There really has been no place for those kinds of folks in the Confucian understanding of a family. And if it's going to continue to have cultural force, it seems to me it's going to have to reckon with these alternative models of what it means to be a family, or to the extent that women are now treated in China and elsewhere as full human beings, alternative models of human beings that include, not having Y chromosomes. Finally, nations Confucianism. This might be the stickiest one, because my sort of impulse is to see nations Confucianism as already having crossed several lines that are really hard to go back over again, particularly in terms of endorsing nationalism and ethnocentrism. But to the extent that nation states don't have to be authoritarian and don't have to be xenophobic, they can value other cultures and they can promote more democratic decision making. Can Confucianism be a part of that? Or is Confucianism sort of doomed to line up on the right-wing side of these questions? These are important questions, not just historically, but because Confucian language continues to influence lots of aspects of life, from superficial to more deep aspects of life all over East Asia, from Japan to Korea, to China, to Taiwan and Singapore and Vietnam, and everywhere that there are people of descent from those places, including the United States, where people of Asian descent are the fastest growing ethnic group. Many, but certainly not all of those people, come from cultural backgrounds in which Confucianism is important. So as Americans, we need to think we need to think through these kinds of questions, whether we have that line of descent or not. I'll leave you with this image. This is from a art exhibit that was put on in Shanghai some years ago, called Q Confucius, like in English, Q, the letter Q. And Q, I think, was meant to stand for question. And it's ambiguous in the way that a lot of interesting art is. This is one of many images that show Confucius emerging as if from underground or from the ocean. Is he menacing people? He's very large. Is he a wonderful rediscovery, sort of being excavated from layers of more recent history? Or is he some kind of Godzilla-like monster rising from the depths to menace modernity? Q Confucius, you get to decide. Thank you very much. And if there's time, I think we have a little bit of time for questions or comments. So I'm open.
Will be great.
Jeff?
Someone called Enoch Choi has got his hand up.
Thank you. Again, thank you for this very insightful and very thought-provoking presentation. I have some questions. I was at Boston in the 1980s and following studying under Du Weiming and Robert Neville and some Bostonian Confucians, so-called.
Me too. If Du Weiming hadn't given me an A on a certain essay, I probably wouldn't be here today.
Anyhow, at that time, I mean, a lot of the students and even some of the general public that I get in touch with, they do show a bit of interest in Confucianism, and especially the religiosity, the pathway of self-cultivation and those type of things. So I'm a bit interested in your assessment of some of the situation in the academy in America right now. I mean, under the seemingly rivalry or competition, between the two countries, and even Elizabeth Perry was bemoaning, some of the interests has diverted, and a lot of things cannot be really reconciled. So I would be interested in hearing your view. And the second question would be very quickly. I mean, I'm also fascinated by your classification of the 4 categories. And there have been some discussion about the role of Confucius Institutes. And how would you categorize Confucius Institute? Would it be I let you head over. Thank you.
Well, let's start there, perhaps. And then I'm sure by the time I've tried to respond to that, you can remind me of what your first question was. That's usually how these things work. My sense, is that Confucian institutes really are pluralistic, that they're not cut from one cloth. And that's because I know a lot of people who run them. But some of those people, I think, are very much servants of what I would call nations Confucianism, some of them for sure. And that's one of the reasons why they've become controversial, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, but especially in Western Europe and the United States and Canada, where they've seen it's sort of seen as a propaganda arm of Xi Jinping's government. Well, they predate Xi Jinping and that sort of ideology and its ascendancy. And initially, they were really just meant to funnel money, which is something the Chinese now have a lot of, in the direction of sort of promoting soft power in outside of China. So, free language classes, et cetera. I teach at a small liberal arts college in Kentucky, in central Kentucky. And for several years in the early part of the century, the local high school was able to offer Chinese language courses entirely through the Confucius Institute at the University of Kentucky, which is about an hour north of us. And this is certainly a resource that wouldn't have been available otherwise. The school board wouldn't have been interested. The budget wouldn't have allowed for it, et cetera. But it was controversial. And I remember distinctly seeing a letter to the editor in the local newspaper saying, it was a parent who was concerned that her child was quote unquote having to study Chinese, which wasn't really the case, but her kid had signed up for Chinese, like you'd sign up for Spanish or whatever. And she says, I don't want my children learning communist languages. Which raised a whole bunch of issues, like how could a language be politically aligned with particular ideology? But it was transparently xenophobic. Unfortunately, that was discontinued in part because of that kind of response. And then about 10 years later, the Confucius Institute at the University of Kentucky itself was discontinued because there was immense political pressure placed on the university administration to avoid the appearance of quote unquote being soft on China. From my point of view, knowing a lot of the people involved, this was really just a big loss for our community because the people I knew who were involved were the last people to uncritically accept the dictates of the Chinese government. In fact, they used to sort of congratulate themselves on how effectively they were subverting certain aspects of the Chinese state by using all this money from China. So I think they were promoting cultural China, not political China. But it is also true, and I don't want to deny this, that in some other institutions, the Confucian Institute has been a very blunt-edged tool used to police conversation about issues like Xinjiang and Tibet and so forth on university campuses. So it can and has been a kind of an organ of nations Confucianism or rulers Confucianism. But I think there was nothing in the design of these institutes that mandated that. I think it probably has to do with who gets to run these things and what their political heritage is in China. The people that I've known most have tended to promote what I would call scholars and householders Confucianism, especially scholars Confucianism. Confucianism, akin to what I think the so-called Boston Confucians were attracted to, the idea of self-cultivation, the idea of Chinese cultural identity as another way of experiencing what it is to be human. And through those kind of traditions. So I don't want to give a black and white up or down answer to that question of Confucius institutions. I think it's institutes. I think that they're multivalent, but I think they've become a casualty of the rapidly disintegrating relationship between China and the United States. And I think that's sad, in the same way that I think it's sad that during World War I, it became harder to study the German language. for example, or people kicked dachshunds in the street, because they were associated with Germans. So, human beings do dumb things sometimes, and this is one of those things, I think. Enoch, you asked another question, and of course, as promised, I've forgotten it. Would you mind re-articulating it?
Very quickly, I would like to let some more time for other people. Anyhow, basically, it's along the line. There is increasingly, a bit of anti-Chinese sentiment, among some community,
Sure.
and in some academic community that I know of. So I'm wondering about the future of East Asian study, in particular Chinese studies, in Harvard or your schools and things like that. What is the future of it? Well, quickly.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yes. I am a Jesuit. I studied Confucianism. I taught university in Hong Kong and also in Australia. There's an increasing trend in Australia, very similarly, that there's a marginalization of Asian studies and Chinese studies.
Well, those are two different things, of course. Asian studies is the biggest category. The truth is, in the United States, a lot of Asian studies is really East Asian studies. And then within East Asian studies, Chinese studies is a subset of that. When you go to the Asian studies conferences, it seems like the overwhelming majority of stuff is either China or Japan. And then everybody else is a smaller piece of the pie. Liz Wilson can probably tell you about that as a South Asia specialist. I think, if you look at numbers, Asian studies is one of the few areas that's connected with the humanities that's not going downhill right now in terms of enrollments across the country. And East Asian languages are one of the few languages that are actually growing in enrollment. Americans in general are less inclined now than probably any moment in the last 150 years to study other cultures or languages, or to study the humanities, period. And so it's interesting that Asian studies has so far survived that purge. There are a lot of different factors, though. And what's interesting to me is that people study different East Asian cultures and languages for very, very different reasons. So a great many of my students are interested in Japan. Their interest in Japan, by and large, has little to do with politics, little to do with Japan's place in the global order, and lots to do with animated movies and video games and cartoons and things like that. So in other words, Japanese soft power has really propelled Japan to a place of attractive interest for American students. Korea is doing something very similar through music and through dramas, television dramas, K-dramas and K-pop. China doesn't have the same kind of soft power impact on American students, at least not right now. That may change. There are C dramas, as they're called, and they are gaining a following, and Netflix has a lot of them, and there are lots of ways that many students, including my students, can encounter them, but it doesn't seem to be quite as common. So why do people study Chinese? Why do people study Chinese history or culture? A lot of it is driven by geopolitics, so it's quite different from Korea and Japan. And I would compare it to the way in which Russian was popularized as a field of study in the from the 50s through the mid 80s. So the people I knew who were interested in Russia weren't interested in Russian literature. They were interested in the Cold War and Russia's role in that. And that's what drove them into it. They may have become specialists in Russian literature, but that's not what drew them in. So that's kind of a mixed blessing. It has the blessing of making China seem super relevant, arguably more relevant than Japanese video games or Confucian pop or Korean pop music. But all of these things are really just gateways. I often tell my students, a door can lead you to a walk-in closet, or it can lead you into the rest of the house. And so, if all you're interested in is figuring out what's wrong with China, why China is bad, knowing your enemy, that's the closet. You're not going to make it very far past that doorway. What we want you to do is disassociate any culture from its particular regime at a given time and explore the richness of that. My hope is that this phenomenon of the full house of China, which was more possible, I think, in the 90s and early 2000s, and it seems right now, will once again be possible. But China's not going to go away. Arguably, the Korean thing might be a flash in the pan as far as our students are concerned. I'm worried about that, to be honest with you. I don't know if it'll last. I can't imagine a world in which China is not relevant. It's simply too old, too big, and too interconnected. But I am worried about the terms of engagement with China. And if they're anything like the terms of engagement with, say, the Soviet Union, then there's a price to be paid for engaging with a culture primarily for its political alignment in the present moment. That, I think, is a mistake. And it would be equally mistaken of young Chinese to take an interest in the United States because they hated Trump or they hated Biden or anybody else that came along the pike. I hope that helps respond to your question. I know that we've run slightly over, but Ms. Laurie was saying that we might do that. David Lowe, it looks like, has had a hand up for quite some time. What would you like to talk about, David?
Yeah, great talk. I really liked your presentation. Yeah, I'm curious about, I guess, ancestor worship, quote unquote, would be the way that Confucian religiosity would present itself. And I'm curious about whether it's regarding a local deity in a town, as was tradition for so long, or a plaques of ancestors on the wall of your house, or rituals in a graveyard. How often is that done in the different segments of Chinese society, whether in the big cities or the rural parts of the country or what? Is that still,
Well, part of being a more diffused and institutional tradition means there's no magisterium to tell people when they have to go worship their ancestors. There's no liturgical calendar in quite the same way. But it is true that in general, the passage of time is marked in part through attention to the dead, particularly spring, right? So we're coming up on spring right now. We're coming up on a time of year where the rite of visitation to one's family graves is undertaken, Qingming, clear and bright. And it's kind of akin to Memorial Day in the South, where you go and you clean up the graves and you remember your dead. So this is also an opportunity for family togetherness, just the way Memorial Day is in places like Kentucky or North Carolina. So that's a really big one. Lunar New Year is another big one. I think it depends on how punctilious or how observant a given family would be. I mean, some people might, because of the Cultural Revolution in mainland China, might go most of their adult lives without participating in any kind of organized ancestor worship. That's certainly possible. Mao's campaign against cultural tradition really, it didn't destroy the culture, but it removed a lot of the infrastructure. And so what's been interesting is watching people try to rebuild that stuff. So ancestor halls have been rebuilt, in the last 5 to 10 years, all over, particularly rural China. Some of it is about making sure that the rural hometown, which traditionally is a very kind of important locus of identity, remains relevant in a country where most people live in a city, right? China is now a majority urban country. Most Chinese people live in a city. That happened in the United States about 100 years ago, but it happened in China around the year 2000. So it's a much more recent development. And along with that massive relocation from the countryside to the cities, there's been a certain amount of erosion of the bonds to the local community. And so when many people would experience that would be to go home at Lunar New Year, which is probably the largest human migration on the planet any given year, is the movement of Chinese back to their hometown for a few days or a few weeks to be with their natal family or their larger clan. And certainly because that's the time when everybody's going to gather, these days especially, a lot of stuff that might have been in pre-modern times dispersed throughout the year will sometimes happen during Lunar New Year. So that's an occasion, I think, where a lot of modern Chinese people would experience that. But looking beyond China, because Confucianism isn't purely a Chinese tradition, it's an East Asian tradition. It's in a tradition of the East Asian diaspora, which includes places like the Philippines and Indonesia, as well as Viet Nam, Japan, Korea, and so forth. Depends on where you go, but for example, in Japan or Korea, it wouldn't be weird in a middle-class home to have a designated corner of the home that's allocated space for ancestor ritual, whether it's as something as seemingly casual as a portrait of the deceased, right? Your parents, which a lot of us who aren't Confucians might have in our house too, right? But it also becomes a ritual space. It's a place to remember death anniversaries and mark the passage of time in other ways. So, for example, in the fall in Japan, there's something called Oban, which is about remembering the dead, both the long dead and the recent dead. In South Korea, there's similar kinds of things. Since our friend Enoch is here, he's probably familiar with this. But one of the interesting things about Chinese Catholicism is that it accommodated a certain amount of ancestor ritual in ways that Protestant Christianity was much more resistant to, although it wasn't uncontroversial in the Catholic tradition. There were big battles over this. But many culturally East Asian Catholics I know, whether they're Vietnamese or Korean or whatever, will often incorporate elements of Confucian, what we might call Confucian ancestor ritual, into things like the Feast of All Saints, right, and All Souls and so forth in the liturgical calendar of the Christian Church. So there are a multitude of ways in which people find meaning for this. But again, from my point of view, the most interesting thing is the conscious, deliberate reconstruction of ways in the modern world to do things that an earlier version of the modern world forbade, right? Particularly communist modernity in mainland China. So, I think maybe we have time for one more question. I'm not sure.
We have
defer to our moderator here.
Yeah, we have 2 more hands up, so feel free
Okay.
if you want to answer those 2, and then we will.
Oh, I see. Right, we're in Zoom, digital hands. Let's see. I don't know who was first here. Chaim, is that right?
Yeah, I think Dorothy, were you before? I don't, nobody. Okay. Thanks, Jeff. First of all, I would like, is there a way of contacting you directly to have a further discussion, or are you kind of a private person?
I'm not private about Confucianism. I'm going to take the unusual step of just sending my email address to everybody in the chat. So there that is. So you can bombard me with whatever it is you want to talk about. So that's there. But it's simply my last name and my first initial, Richey J. Please use the correct Irish spelling, not the idiosyncratic Scottish spelling.
Jeff.
So what's up, Chaim?
Yeah, the only question I would have, and it kind of blows everything out of the water here, so I don't, it's probably very time consuming, but it seems like all religions are of a relative nature. Okay, human being, we know obviously the generic term human being. Human, again, is every religion in the universe. Being, do we understand that nature? Human being, I mean, that's God, another term for God. We forgot about that, right? I mean, from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, according to the Christian religion, they got banished from it. They couldn't even learn about it. Because obviously they wouldn't learn about it because it wasn't knowledge. That was a tree of knowledge. But the tree of life is being God, absolute. We don't know absolute. We aren't absolute. Okay, we're only human. We fail and we say, what's the first thing? I'm only human. Okay. Well,
sure. And Chaim, I think I would say to that what for another person, the phrase only human might come across as a limitation or as a negative judgment, like, oh, geez, I'm just not up to the task of understanding the infinite. I think from the Confucian perspective, that's a positive statement. I'm only human. Everything I need to know is right here in the human experience. I don't need recourse to something outside of the human experience because the human connects to all these other cosmological spheres. And so Enoch and I share a teacher, Du Wei Ming, one of the sort of great modern Confucian scholars, who would talk about Confucianism as a kind of humanism. And what he meant by that, I think, was just that. It really goes back to what I was trying to say earlier about Kongzi saying, Humans are group animals, social species, and within our interactions with each other, we perform all of the functions that have analogs with other cosmic processes, right? So we are active in some roles, we're receptive in others, the same way that there is light and darkness and so forth and so on. And there's this very grand scheme that doesn't require the human being to be redeemed or saved by something outside of itself, but actually only humans can save humans, I think, from a Confucian perspective. Having said that, historically, some Confucians could be quite judgmental about other traditions. Jushi, who I talked about earlier, is sort of the great architect of householders Confucianism in the Song Dynasty about 1,000 years ago. Talks out of two sides of his mouth. On one side of his mouth, he says, you know what? Everything in the universe is chi. Everything is energy or matter, because that's two different understandings of what chi is. It's sort of Einsteinian, I suppose, in some ways. It's both matter and energy. Everything's chi. The weather is chi. Human beings are chi. Gods are chi. So he's sort of rationalizing things in his way, kind of a Renaissance man in some ways. On the other hand, so that seems to put everybody, as you say, in sort of a relative kind of understanding. On the other hand, he says, but you know the problem? If you're a Daoist or a Buddhist, you really screw up your chi. You don't want to do that. You want to be a Confucian. You want to worship the ancestors. You want to learn from the past. Don't mess around with that freaky stuff. Don't mess around with foreign cultures. So on that side, not some chi is more equal than others, I suppose. And so there is a history of sectarian rivalry. Going back to that diagram I showed you early on tonight with the three pyramids, I think you only see that kind of sectarian judgment that we're saved and you're not stuff at the pinnacle of those pyramids. The further you go down, the less people care. And really, honestly, I think in the lives of most people, at least in pre-modern East Asia, it was really difficult to tell where Daoism stopped, Confucianism started, Buddhism picked up. Most people participated at some level in all three, as well as something we might call Chinese popular religion or Japanese popular religion that sort of glued them all together. So I guess this is my great theme for tonight. There's more than one kind of Confucianism. There's more than one kind of answer to those kinds of questions. And there's that. Dorothy, did you have something you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, you might have answered it though, but my question was, what do contemporary Chinese Confucian-trained bureaucrats think is the best way to live with the Russians right now?
Live with the Russians? Is that what you said?
Well, you were the one who said that they have to find a way to live with others, relate to others.
Sure.
So what's your take on that?
Okay. Well, I think the first thing to point out is that there haven't been officially government-trained Confucian scholars since 1905. So that was a reform that was carried out in the last 10 years of the last dynasty as a way to kind of keep a revolution from happening, and it didn't work. The revolution came anyway. This is where we get back to the institutional versus the diffused thing, Dorothy. I promise I'll try to offer some commentary on the Russians, but just to kind of clear a few things up. It's very difficult to find institutional Confucianism today in China. If you were going to find it, it would be vested in local communities that would, for example, build these wedding halls or ancestor halls, or more likely at the kind of nations Confucianism level that I talked about towards the end with Chinese universities and the Chinese Communist Party pushing various elements of Confucian culture as probably more for ethnocentric and nationalistic reasons than for what I would think of as authentic Confucian reasons. Having said that, there are people, walking, talking people in China especially, and also to some extent in South Korea, who would say, yes, I'm a Confucian. I'm a card-carrying Confucian. I'm a Confucian intellectual. There are a number of these people in China. They've sort of returned to the status of someone like Kongzi. They're nerds. Nobody really likes them that much because they're these kind of wonky, geeky guys. They're always guys. who are interested in the past. So there's this one fellow who says that, China needs to abandon both Western-style democracy and Soviet-style authoritarianism, and instead adopt a kind of a weird hybrid where we would have a democratically elected lower house, sort of like a House of Commons in the British Parliament model, and then we'd have a undemocratically appointed body of Confucian scholars and cultural dignitaries, sort of like a House of Lords or a House of Peers, to advise and ratify and so forth things that the lower body did. But nobody's listening to this guy. I mean, he publishes books and he gets on TV, but he's kind of seen as a crank. So at the moment, I don't think it's really all that easy to find someone who would say, perform the function of like England's first rabbi, or something like that, where there's an official spokesperson for a given tradition. Having said that, I've tried to make the case that the Confucian values I talked about tonight permeate many levels of decision-making and animate many values throughout society. And one thing that is certainly historically consistent with the Confucian tradition has been a principled objection to the application of military force to the resolution of political problems. Xi Jinping is not making things up when he says things like there is a tradition in the Confucian past of promoting peace, at least in the form of avoiding aggression. But that there are other ways to wage war other than through tanks and missiles and so forth. I think a lot of why Confucius institutes are being shut down is because there's a perception that they're being weaponized in a kind of a soft power war. The issue, I think, of Ukraine and Russia, which is horrible to watch unfold. As somebody told me the other day, I never thought I'd get to experience the whole 20th century in a 2-year period, but here we are. I think if you're going to try to think about that from a Confucian perspective, we have to ask really basic questions like, what does war do to families? Families are really essential from a Confucian point of view. We might argue, and we will argue in the contemporary world about what constitutes a family, but Confucians have never argued anything other than families being central to what it means to be human. This is how we learn how to be humans. Well, what happens when, like one of my students' fathers, you have to leave your family? I have students from Ukraine, and you go and you pick up your Kalashnikov and you're gone, and who knows when you'll come back or if you'll come back. What does that do to the family? From a Confucian perspective, there's a huge role that's now missing. The father can't be a father, and the daughter can't be a daughter because there's no father there. So at some level, war is always bad because war always jeopardizes family life. And at a broader level, war is bad because it jeopardizes the family-like relations that are supposed to exist between and within nations. So historically, in China and elsewhere, the model of human interaction that was projected onto both national communities and international relations was that of the family. Now, this could be very paternalistic, right? So the emperor is kind of like a big daddy, and the citizens are like little children, or subjects are like little children. But ultimately, particularly outside of China, particularly in Korea and Japan, there was this notion that Confucianism was part of what allowed these cultures to coexist with each other and learn from each other as members of a larger family. And that was really ruptured only in fairly recent history by Japanese colonialism and other kinds of developments. So from that point of view, war is not just a failure to maintain the most basic unit of human life, the family, but it also is a failure to successfully model that on an international level. Ukraine and Russia, I suppose, are siblings in one larger international family, and the whole goal of Confucian practice is to harmonize hierarchy, not weaponize it. And so from this point of view, I think we'd have to say this is a failure. Most Confucian statesmen have opposed war. Or have argued that war represents a kind of a moral failure. There are exceptions, as always. I'm not going to whitewash this for you. Wang Yangming, very famous Ming Dynasty, Confucian was also a general, and participated in Ming military campaigns. He justified these in part by assuming that when China won a battle, it was ultimately to help civilize other people. So there was a certain number of assumptions he was willing to make. And perhaps everybody makes those kinds of assumptions in these conflicts. But I think one big difference between not only Confucianism and Christian traditions and Islamic traditions, but even with Buddhist traditions, is that there just isn't a holy war tradition in the Confucian tradition in the same way that there has been in many, many other religious traditions. So at that level, I think, what can you say but no, right? This shouldn't be happening. But I have to admit to you, Dorothy, my feelings about this conflict are very strong. And so it's possible that I'm not able to respond to this as objectively as I could. I really wish this conflict wasn't happening right now. Jessica, where are we on things?
I think we are going to need to wrap it up here, but I really love the way that we've tied this into current events, and thank you for that. And thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. Thank you everyone for being here. And our website is oxfordinterfaithcenter.org. And you can also check out the rest of the videos on our YouTube channel. And I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for the invitation and for the good questions. Good night, everyone.